So, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard have both filed for their appeal. In Amber's document, they listed 16 different points of errors in the court's judgment, and instead of dissecting every single point and argument, I'm just going to talk about the most important factor, the strongest point in her appeal, which is that the jury's verdicts are inherently and irreconcilably inconsistent, because I think that this is the obvious downfall of why Amber Heard lost her case, was that there's something deeply flawed about these 7 jury members, and I think that is the only reason why she lost. I don't think it's the medical records or anything like that. Having more evidence, I think the evidence that was provided was enough to rule that Johnny Depp had at least abused Amber Heard at least one time. So I think that is the strongest point here. In the document, it states that this case involves 2 essentially mirror image defamation claims asserted against the only 2 people who truly know whether the statements at issue are true or false. If Mr. Depp did not abuse Miss Heard, she indisputably knows her claim that he did is false. If Mr. Depp did abuse Miss Heard during their brief marriage, he knows that Mr. Waldman's statements calling Miss Heard a liar are false. So the jury ended up agreeing with Amber that she was defamed by the statement by Waldman that said, "Quite simply, this was an ambush, a hoax. They set Mr. Depp up by calling the cops, but the first attempt didn't do the trick. The officers came to the penthouse, thoroughly searched and interviewed, and left after seeing no damage to face or property. So Amber and her friends spilled a little wine and roughed the place up, got their story straight under the direction of a lawyer and a publicist, and then placed a second call to 911. So this is an important thing, because I don't know what the jury members are trying to say by ruling this way, because some people have argued that they didn't mean that Johnny Depp was abusive on this particular incident, and that it means that they didn't actually place a second call to 911. However, if the jury were going to award Amber Heard $2 million, you would think it would mean that they believe that he abused her somewhat, because $2 million is a big amount. That's her salary for the Aquaman 2 movie, so it's a big number to award if they're only saying it was because she didn't place a second call to 911. I think it suggests that they believe this one particular incident of abuse, and if they do, then that should have meant that Johnny Depp would lose his case completely based on that, if that is what they meant. It's unclear though, because it's hard to understand the nonsensical decision that the jury made. Now, in Johnny's appeal, he is arguing that he should not be held responsible for his lawyer's statements and actions. However, they said that you can count Waldman as an agent of him and acting on his wishes, and this makes sense because I think if Johnny Depp were to hire a lawyer and say that the abuse claims are false, would be a reckless disregard for the truth, because when we look at the evidence, we see that during their relationship, they had gone to therapy. Johnny and Amber had gone to marriage therapy to discuss the violence and abuse in their relationship. And we also saw text messages between Johnny and Amber referencing different incidents of abuse, of him apologizing to her, of her directly telling him to his face that he had been violent with her whilst under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And this is something that it would suggest that the abuse claims are not a hoax if there has been this long record of it for years and years, going back to 2011. There were records of this. Now, even though some of her medical evidence, the therapy notes, were left out, I still think that there was plenty of evidence that was shown to us, audio tapes of him saying that they had physically abused each other. And just narratively speaking, even though we didn't get the jury didn't get to see the actual therapy notes, narratively speaking, both Johnny and Amber did mention in their testimony that they had gone to therapy, that they had been speaking to each other about violence and abuse. So this was a thing that was already said. So I don't think we need to see the actual medical records and know the exact particulars of what was said in those therapy sessions to know that this was not a hoax, that there is truth to there being abuse in their relationship. And so because of this, I think ultimately they will end up setting aside the jury's verdict, their decision, because it doesn't make that much sense, and there is no way to harmonize these verdicts based on the evidence that is shown. So I don't think that it will stand the way it is. Something that we heard a lot while the trial was happening was that it was very unlikely for Johnny Depp to win his defamation suit, and that it was more about him winning in the eyes of the public. He said that from the very beginning, the goal of bringing this case was to reveal the truth, regardless of the outcome. Speaking the truth was something that I owed to my children and to all those who have remained steadfast in their support of me. I feel at peace knowing I have finally accomplished that. Many experts weighed in, explaining how it would be very difficult for him to win this defamation suit, especially based on these vague statements that Amber Heard made. And therefore, it seems like something really went wrong in the jury deliberations and perhaps some confusions as to what they were deciding on. And I just wanted to talk about this a little bit more because there were two amicus briefs filed alongside Amber Heard's appeal, and they were just explaining some quotes of a male juror to Good Morning America, explaining why they came to their decision, and they were trying to explain that there is some misunderstanding of abuse based on this person saying some of these things. So the one juror who did speak out said that a lot of Amber's story didn't add up, and that was the reason why they ruled in Johnny Depp's favor. They said it didn't come across as believable. They said it seemed like she was able to flip the switch on her emotions. She would answer one question and she would be crying, and 2 seconds later she would turn ice cold. It didn't seem natural. And then they said that Johnny Depp just seemed a little more real in terms of how he responded to questions. And in this amicus brief, they explained that her reactions seemed pretty typical for a victim of abuse, and that sometimes abusers can seem calm in situations like this. So the way that they reacted didn't seem abnormal for this type of situation. The juror also went on to say that Heard's defense ultimately did not prove that Depp was physically abusive towards the actress, and on the contrary, the jury found that Heard was actually the aggressor in their relationship, and that they were both abusive to each other, which is a direct quote, that this one juror said that they were both abusive to each other. And I think that this is a really strong point that was included in the amicus brief, because if they use the word abusive and describe Johnny Depp as that, it suggests that Amber Heard's op-ed was not a lie, because even they have agreed to it to some extent. And they also explained how they didn't take into account psychological, emotional, other forms of abuse besides the physical. And in terms of the physical abuse, because they said that there wasn't any proof of it that was presented in court, and her appeal outlines that there was some proof of physical abuse, including a tape from Johnny Depp saying that they had both physically abused each other. He said that, and he's made mention of how he's in fear of them being a crime scene waiting to happen. He's talked about headbutting her. Amber Heard has accused Johnny Depp on tape of beating her up, and he's never denying it, replies by saying, "I made a mistake." So there were things like that. So it's interesting that the jury couldn't find proof that Johnny Depp was ever physically abusive of her, even though Johnny Depp himself said that he was. And anyway, the juror goes on to say that they believed that they had their husband-wife arguments. They were both yelling at each other. I don't think that makes either of them right or wrong. That's what you do when you get into an argument, I guess. But to rise to the level of what she was claiming, there wasn't enough or any evidence that really supported what she was saying. And again, in her appeal, Amber's lawyers are going to bring up the point of how there was some evidence that was left out that could have strengthened her case. So that is a good point. And there were many missteps. They said that there were many missteps from her defense. And according to the juror, that included the testimony regarding the $7 million donation/pledge thing, and how this was something that they spent a third of the time deliberating on. And in her appeal, they bring up the fact that this was not actually relevant to the case at hand. Whether or not she donated this amount wouldn't factor into whether or not Johnny Depp abused her. So a lot of time and energy was wasted on this, and it distracted the jury from the point of the case. And the juror said that this was an important fact to them, and they said that it made them think that Amber Heard was disingenuous, which is interesting. Furthermore, the juror questioned why, if Heard wasn't in an abusive relationship, why she would gift Johnny Depp a large knife. He says, if you have a battered wife or spouse situation, why would you buy the other person, the aggressor, a knife? And this is what they use to justify the decision to Amber Heard lying, perhaps, about the abuse. And again, the amicus briefs highlight the misunderstandings that the general public have about abusive situations, and kind of explain that this jury was not really informed about these types of situations to understand it. It's also worth mentioning that this juror said that they ended up not taking into account any of the witness testimony, any of the experts, any of the witnesses on either side. They didn't take that into account when they made their decision. So even though an expert might have explained to them some of these dynamics a little bit better, it was all discounted, and that would have really affected the decision. And speaking about this whole knife situation, regardless of what they think, that they believe that it's weird that she would gift him a knife, the fact of the matter is that, and they know this, that Amber Heard and Johnny Depp were discussing violence and abuse in their relationship, and that was evidence that was shown to them. They were given tapes of them talking about this type of thing, Johnny Depp saying that they were a crime scene waiting to happen. There is truth to there being a violent, abusive relationship, so I don't understand what this juror means by this comment. And also, I wanted to point out that a lot of their arguments, they were pulling out points that were made by Johnny Depp's attorneys. They weren't focusing on the arguments made by Amber Heard's attorneys and saying if there were strengths to that. And it suggests that there may be some sort of bias to favouring Johnny Depp. It seems like there's some selective hearing. And the stenographer came out and said that a lot of the jurors fell asleep during some of the testimony, and that could be a reason why they are seeming to miss out a lot of information. I find it very strange that this juror is focusing on these minor parts of the case that don't really matter very much, and are ignoring completely these gigantic pieces of evidence that was presented to them, all these audio tapes of Johnny Depp admitting to the abuse, the text messages of him admitting to abuse. It's very strange that they didn't take that into account. And the juror was talking about if they were impacted by social media or the celebrity sway, and they said that that's not true. He says, some people said we were bribed. That's not true. Social media did not impact us. We followed the evidence. We didn't take into account anything outside of the courtroom. We only looked at the evidence. They were very serious accusations and a lot of money involved, so we weren't taking it lightly. So again, it's just very strange. Like, it's very selective. It seems like there is some selective hearing because the evidence that they've picked out here are all leaning towards Johnny Depp's side, and they haven't made any mention to the strong pieces of evidence made on Amber Heard's side. And you do wonder, is it because they were asleep at those moments and they didn't hear it? And I think that this is the biggest downfall of the case, was this jury. They didn't seem to want to side with Amber Heard for some reason. But ultimately, I think that they included this quote, "They were both abusive to each other," in one of the amicus briefs, is going to be very important. I think that's a very damning statement that was made by the jurors, and it shows that they either did not understand what they were supposed to be deciding on, or for some reason felt like confused by this the headline, the sexual violence headline, and thinking that's the thing that they needed to decide on. I think that could be the issue with this case, but that's the main problem, I think. In one of the amicus briefs that was filed alongside Amber's appeal, they made this really great point that given that Mr. Depp was awarded $10 million in compensatory damages by the jury, due process requires some basis for such an award. If large claims for defamation can be awarded in the absence of evidence of causation of harm, media organizations across the Commonwealth have good reason to shut down their editorial and news departments in fear of such an enormous potential verdict. So I think that this is a great point to make, because it highlights that this decision would not be made in a normal situation. Like, defamation cases are very hard to win in general, and this was seen to be an unwinnable lawsuit for Johnny Depp because of how vague her statements were, the fact that she didn't name him, the fact that he previously said that nobody made false accusations for financial gain. He had lost the UK judgment. Like, there's been so many issues with this, and a lot of people didn't think that he was going to win, and it sort of highlights that the reason that he did win was because of this popularity contest, because people disliked Amber Heard a lot, was the reason for why the jury decided to make this nonsensical decision of awarding $10 million, which is a very absurd, nonsensical number. I don't think that the jury, if you put a gun to their head, I don't think any of them can give you a logical explanation for how they arrived at that number. I think it doesn't make any sense. There is this one quote from one of the jury members who said, "Some people said we were bribed." Now, I don't think that anybody said that they had been bribed, and they said, "That's not true. Social media did not impact us. We followed the evidence. We didn't take into account anything outside the courtroom. We only looked at the evidence. They were very serious accusations and a lot of money involved, so we weren't taking it lightly," which is so hilarious because we know the truth. We know that that's a filthy lie, because when the verdict was read out, they had not properly filled out the forms, and they had to go back out and decide very quickly what the amounts they were going to award to Johnny and Amber were. And it was that they awarded Johnny Depp $10 million for the compensatory damages and $5 million for punitive damages, and they awarded Amber Heard this $2 million in compensatory damages and no money for punitive damages. It's so wild, it's so stupid. And with the punitive damages, apparently that was supposed to be that is capped at $350,000, so the judge reduced it to that amount. So it shows you that the jury members did not know what they were doing. They were just filling out numbers really quickly. They didn't put too much thought into it. Depp originally sought $50 million in his damages because his pay for Pirates of the Caribbean is around $40 million, and Heard sought $100 million in her case. So it's very bizarre that they ended up in these numbers. And when he's saying that they just did what they thought was best, I think that this suggests, because the only way that these numbers make sense to me is that the $2 million for Amber Heard is the exact same amount as her Aquaman salary for the second movie. So maybe that's their logic behind that one. And then for the $10 million for Johnny Depp, I feel like, I mean, $15 million, but it was supposed to be $50 million. I kind of see that the only way it makes sense is that it's supposed to be this really thinly veiled, snarky message to Amber Heard, and it's double what she received in her divorce settlement, because she received $7 million. So I think that's why they did it. It seems very mean-spirited to arrive at that number. They know that is not money, that she doesn't have that much money, so she would not be able to pay it. So it seems very mean-spirited that they would give her that amount. It's not logically sound. There's no way to justify this amount at all. So it's bizarre to come to this number. And I also want to point out that there was a man in the jury pool who they could not exclude, who read this text message from his wife saying, "Amber is psychotic. If a man says a woman beat him, they never believe him." So I think that there might have been some people in this jury that were biased towards Amber Heard. They also said that no one in the jury was starstruck, and the individual celebrity never played a factor in their decision, which I do believe. I think that is possible, that they weren't doing things because they liked Johnny Depp more. I kind of see it as that they seem to be doing what they did because they really disliked Amber Heard, and there are many things that he has said that suggest that the jury members really disliked Amber Heard, and that is why they arrived at that decision. They said none of us were really fans of either one of them. They knew Johnny Depp more than Amber Heard, but hadn't seen many of his films. So I think that makes sense. But I still think that it is possible that they do have some sort of bias. And maybe it's affected by the social media vitriol, not sure. But there is a big problem with these wild numbers that they've arrived at. There were a lot of negative reports about Johnny Depp prior to Amber Heard's op-ed that were bad for his reputation, talking about his heavy drinking and constant lateness to the sets of Pirates of the Caribbean, and saying that he was going to be out of the movie based on this. It had specifying that was the cause, not necessarily this wife-beating aspect, because typically we know abusive men don't get fired because of abuse claims. Like, there are many examples of this. So I think that this is a very important thing to bring up, because it could have affected the jury's decision. Probably not. I don't trust this jury. There's something deeply wrong with their decision making, but I think it is an important piece of evidence that was left out. There was also this article where they spoke about Johnny Depp's business managers who had this lawsuit against him, and said that they knew that Johnny Depp had engaged in violence against Miss Heard. Depp was described as extremely volatile and had sometimes gotten physical with Miss Heard, and I think it's also in reference to the Boston plane flight incident where some people had to be paid off for their silence, perhaps. So this is one of this is a very important piece of the puzzle that was left out, and it really could have affected some of the jury members' decision making if it was left in. So this is a very important piece. In Amber's appeal, it states that the trial court erred in two ways. First, that the trial court's refusal to exclude the headline from evidence led to the introduction of irrelevant and prejudicial evidence and arguments about whether Depp had committed sexual violence against Heard, a phrase that does not appear in the challenge portions of the op-ed authored by Heard, as opposed to other forms of abuse, the word that Heard did use, thus infecting the jury's verdict as a whole. And I think that this is a really interesting point. So first off, I want to say that when it comes to the numbers that they awarded to both of them, what I think might be happening is that they do believe that Johnny Depp abused her in some of the other ways, like verbal, emotional. I think that the jury is saying that that could be true, but they believe that Amber Heard is lying about the sexual assault and the physical abuse, and I think that that's why they awarded her 2 million, because that is a significant number. I think it's saying that the abuse wasn't exactly a hoax, but they believe that some of it is, and that's why they awarded Johnny Depp this bigger number, which was supposed to be 15 million, but now it's 10.3 something. Anyway, something that we have to keep in mind is that Amber Heard had not officially accused Johnny Depp of any sexual assault publicly until this trial, until Johnny Depp forced her to do this trial with him. None of this information was public. In 2016, when she got her TRO, she accused Johnny Depp of emotional, psychological, physical abuse during the entirety of the relationship, and she outlined 3 incidents, which was December 2015, the headbutt incident, which Johnny Depp admitted to doing, this birthday incident where there is some sort of fight that occurred that day, and this phone incident where he does admit to throwing a phone and I guess it hit her in the face. So there is some proof to this incident, and the jury seems to agree with the phone incident because they awarded her 2 million for that. So that is what she accused him of. She never said anything about Australia in 2016. And based on these 3 incidents, when Johnny Depp and Amber Heard divorced, they made a mutual statement saying neither party has made false accusations for financial gain. So this would suggest that it is kind of public knowledge that Johnny Depp had abused her. She became a public figure representing domestic abuse because of this. So when she wrote her op-ed in 2018, there was a headline that said something about her speaking up about sexual violence and that she faced some backlash and that it needs to change. And because she didn't name Johnny Depp at all, I don't see any reason why people would ever think that she was talking about him. And when you read her op-ed, she talks about domestic abuse when she was a child, being abused when she was a child, and she also says that she was sexually assaulted before college age, which was before she met Johnny Depp. So I don't see any reason to think that it would link to him. And on top of that, when you think about Amber Heard, who was an actress who had been working in Hollywood since she was about 17, she's very pretty, and the op-ed was about men in power being protected. It's unclear who she could be talking about. She could have been talking about many different people she hasn't publicly named. She's been linked to other famous, powerful men, such as Elon Musk, James Franco, perhaps, other people. So I don't see any reason to think that this article was specifically talking about Johnny Depp until now, until he forced her to come forward and tell her story of what happened in their relationship. I think that this is a really strong point that she made in her appeal, because you have to think about, is this op-ed factually correct in what it's saying in and of itself? Because I think sometimes the jury is confused by, there's a lot of distractions that happened in the court. It became kind of a circus with some of the things that got brought up that didn't really need to be brought up, and that's not what they needed to decide on. The question is, would people have linked this idea of sexual violence to Johnny Depp based on her previous accusations, which was the headbutt incident, the incident on her birthday, and the incident about the mobile phone? would people have linked sexual violence to him at all based on what she said publicly at that time? And I think the answer is no. I don't think that people would have thought that she was talking about him. I think for me, because I don't really know very much about Amber Heard, I think a lot of people don't know that much about her. I think most people would just think she was talking about someone else that you didn't know, and you must have just missed that storyline because you don't keep up with everything that's going on. I don't think a reasonable jury could infer that the op-ed was calling Johnny Depp out because she only accused him of physical abuse. And perhaps that is something that they are taking into account, but that they think it's wrong for her to accuse him of physical abuse. However, again, there were tapes of Johnny Depp admitting, he says, that they physically abuse each other. So it's just strange that they would if they would truly believe that she was accusing him of sexual violence based on this headline. So I think there's a lot of confusion in the instructions that was given to them. I think that they were unclear about what they were deciding on, if they think that she was saying that this was all about Johnny Depp, especially this line about how she was sexually assaulted before college age. I don't think we can reasonably say that this op-ed was incorrect until Johnny Depp brought on this lawsuit. When we go by the facts and the fact that she never named Johnny Depp at all in this op-ed, I think that you have to say that there is nothing objectively false about anything written in it, especially when you take out the context of what happened in the trial. Now I just want to focus on this idea that, say the jury was confused and they believe that their decision is about whether or not Johnny Depp committed sexual violence against Amber Heard. And I just want to talk about the reason why they ruled against that. Why did they disbelieve that Johnny Depp committed sexual violence against Amber Heard based on the evidence that was shown to them? So I just want to talk about this Australia incident primarily, because this is a he said, she said type of thing, and they said that they sided with Johnny Depp because he seemed a bit more real. Amber Heard's story did not add up. So with Johnny Depp, he seems to, when he did his testimony, I felt like he kind of made it seem like the abuse that Amber did to him was sort of minor, it was petty. She was yelling at him for no reason, throwing things around. He made it seem like it wasn't that big a deal. He says it never had to come to this. We never needed to, get restraining orders or anything like that. He never saw a restraining order against her for anything that she did. And he is quoted to have said that he also never wanted a divorce from her. He said, "I never wanted a divorce. I do not want a divorce. I do not want you out of my life." And he downplayed this violence quite a lot with Amber, and he made it seem like she was being overdramatic, that she was being hysterical by suggesting that it was necessary for her to want to get a restraining order against him. Now let me just say that one more time, that the blood-writing, drunken, cocaine-fueled menace did not understand why someone would want to get a restraining order against him. He seemed very, very confused about that when he was speaking, and that really confused me. And oddly enough, the jury seemed to side with him. The juror seems to agree that this thing between Johnny and Amber was petty, it was minor. He described it as they had their husband-wife arguments. They were both yelling at each other. He's making it seem like it's such a typical thing. Husbands and wives normally have fights like this. He doesn't think that either one of them is right or wrong. That's what you do when you get into an argument, he says. But to rise to the level of what she what she was claiming, there wasn't enough or any evidence that really supported what she was saying. Amber Heard showed us pictures of Johnny Depp's deranged messages in his own blood. I don't understand how he can say that there was no evidence to support what she was saying at all. And there was a lot of evidence that was left out, which I want to talk about. And the main difference between the UK and the US, because in the UK, this incident was ruled to be true, because there was more evidence that was allowed in, including this 5-hour secret Australia tape that had his employees talking about the situation straight after it happened. Amber tried to submit this for evidence, but it wasn't allowed because one of the people speaking is dead, Jerry Judge, who said a lot of things that would have really helped bolster her case. It strengthened her version of events because they said that Amber Heard's story doesn't add up, but you see Jerry Judge kind of confirming and agreeing with what she said in some portions of the tape. I think it is sort of impossible for Amber Heard to get conclusive evidence of sexual assault in the manner that she described. But I think with the amicus briefs, they explained that her story does make sense. It is a believable story. The fact that she didn't report it immediately, these are normal things, and they were kind of like, it's important to dispel some of these rape myths because something that Johnny Depp's defense said that because she didn't report it immediately, that must mean that she's lying and things like that, and that's not necessarily true. But in terms of the physical abuse, what I want to focus on is a portion of the tape that was left out where Jerry Judge motions to seeing 2 bruises on Amber Heard. He says she's got a bruise here, she's got a bruise underneath, and then finishes it off by saying she hit him, she slapped him yesterday. And I guess that's a way to say that it's justifiable for Johnny Depp to then cause at least 2 bruises on her because she admitted to slapping him first. And this would have been something that if it was left in, it could have affected the way the jury saw it because there are witnesses to a physical injury on her. And it also shows that his employees were willing to cover up for him. Dr. Kipper was quoted to have said, "I told Ben we'd cover if the police investigate." And it shows that the staff had the intention to lie to protect Johnny Depp. And I think the fact that Jerry Judge says that he saw some of these things, like the cuts on her arms, he also says that he believes it was self-inflicted, and the doctor also says that the nurse noticed these cuts on her arms and they weren't really looking to get her any medical attention for it. They just supplied her with medication and took her out of the country, so it shows a lack of care for her. They explicitly say on the tapes that Johnny Depp is a priority client, that Amber Heard doesn't matter, that they weren't bothered with dealing with her at the time. They mentioned that she was crying non-stop after the event, that she was holding Jerry Judge's hand, and crying every 5 minutes. So this is something that is possibly suggestive that something bad happened to her, that this could have been after a traumatic event such as being sexually assaulted a few hours prior to this. So I think if this tape was allowed, it could have affected the jury's judgment, and that is a major difference between the UK trial's judgment and the decision in the US. Now, on the tapes that was actually allowed in courts and the jury did hear, was that Johnny Depp said to Amber that he was scared to death of their situation, that they were a crime scene waiting to happen, and sort of saying that either one of them would be dead as a result of their fights. And when he says stuff like that, the fact that Johnny Depp continuously said that this thing between him and Amber was a fight. He never said, Amber beat me up while I did nothing. He makes it seem as if it's both of them. Amber Heard is different. She tells Johnny Depp to his face that he beat her up, and when she says to him that he beat her up, in response, Johnny Depp says, "I made a mistake. I won't do it again," things of that nature. And that is something that was allowed in the trial. So this is why I believe that, like, adding more evidence wouldn't have affected anything, because there's something about the way the jury, this one juror was explaining things, where it's like they seem to have this strong bias leaning towards Johnny Depp in order to decide what they decided, in order to ignore the blood writing, in order to think that the text message of "let's drown her before we burn her, I will fuck her burnt corpse afterwards to make sure she is dead," to think that that is not an important factor in deciding if one guy could possibly be a rapist. I think that that's very interesting that these 7 people felt that way. And lastly, I want to read out this quote from the juror who said, "If you mix alcohol and marijuana, that's where you usually end up, passed out. We discussed at length that a lot of the drugs she said he used, most of them were downers. You usually don't get violent on downers. You become a zombie, as those pictures show." Now, this is the problem. These 7 people that were in the jury are idiots, and they were not listening to what Amber Heard said. Amber Heard specifically said for this Australia incident that he did ecstasy and cocaine. Cocaine is a stimulant. Also, people do get violent when they drink excessive alcohol. And I don't see how this person can say this statement and think that they make any sense. And this is the major downfall of this trial, is that the people on this jury were very, very stupid, it seems. They were so stupid that they sided with this guy who said that he had a nervous breakdown and he ended up finger painting all over the house with his own blood, and they still think that this person was a zombie. He could not have possibly have been violent, even though he had the energy to go all over the house finger painting in his own blood after he had this really drastic injury of his whole fingertip being sliced off. That's what he's decided to do. They side with him because he explained it in a very calm, an eerily calm tone, actually. The way that he said that should not have given someone a sense of this person is real, this person is in the right. And I think we should never forget that this is who they sided with. No, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard did not get into your typical husband and wife fights. This is a very unusual situation. It's not like everyone else. It wasn't a minor thing. She's not hysterical. I don't care what Amber Heard is. I don't care if she's dead inside or what. This is an objectively scary thing for someone to go all over the house finger painting in their own blood is terrifying. There's no other way to see it. And it makes you wonder what is up with these 7 people, because with the jury pool, like I said, one of the jurors could not be excluded, and he had a wife who said that Amber Heard is psychotic. They say Amber Heard is psychotic, not the blood-writing, drunken, cocaine-fueled menace. He's not psychotic, apparently. They couldn't exclude some of these people. They try to eliminate people who have been victims of domestic abuse because they can be kind of biased when they make decisions. And it makes you wonder, who are these 7 people allowed in who downplay blood writing, who downplay messages of joking about necrophilia? Who are these people? I don't know what they got up to think that this is just normal. It really doesn't seem like a very reasonable jury, and I don't think any amount of evidence could have changed things. I think that what can you do when you have a jury that is like this, that is so unreasonable to decide that this very abusive behavior is suddenly not abusive enough to say sexual, like, even if the headline is about sexual violence, the fact that he's joked about doing that, the fact that he's writing her messages in his own blood, is that not sexual violent enough for you, even if you don't have conclusive evidence of this bottle assault? Can't you? Because how can you side with his version of events over hers? It's unbelievable to me. And even though this one juror says that they were not fans of Johnny Depp or anything like that, I have no reason to completely believe what they're saying. I don't know if they're telling the truth about that, because I cannot fathom this level of bias to think that this type of behavior is in any way something that makes sense, something that is okay, something that is... In what universe is what he did not abusive? The missing 5-hour tape from evidence is an important factor. However, I still think that there was plenty of evidence as is to say that the likelihood that he did do it is more likely than Amber Heard making up the story out of thin air, because there is some evidence of, you catch someone red-handed, like she's taken pictures of someone writing these deranged notes in his own blood, and the guy is saying that I had a nervous breakdown, not totally sure what happened after that. Like, that is not comforting in the least. Why would you go and side with what he said over what she said? He didn't say anything. He couldn't remember most of it. It's crazy. This is a bad jury. This is a bad jury that did not know what they were doing. I wanted to highlight this really interesting comment by the juror who said, if she didn't do any of the stuff with the op-eds, Johnny Depp could have helped her out in her career. They didn't leave things on a nasty turn. It turned nasty after the op-ed. Now, I don't know if there's anything that could showcase to you more that the jurors were asleep, they did not know what was happening, if they truly believe that they did not end things on a nasty turn. Johnny Depp texted his sister, a producer, after Amber Heard filed for divorce, saying that he wants her off of the WB movie. This is before the op-ed. And also before the op-ed, the day before they made that mutual statement saying neither party made false accusations for financial gain, Johnny Depp said that he wanted to fight things out in court and promised global humiliation to Amber Heard. So I don't understand where they're getting this thing of that it didn't turn nasty until Amber Heard published this op-ed, this really vague op-ed about the Violence Against Women Act. I don't know how they arrived at that notion. And what I also find interesting is that they believe that Amber should have, kind of sucked up to Johnny Depp after they broke up and still sort of depend on him to help her out in her career. It's weird that they have this belief that that is something that makes sense. And I think it, again, highlights that they have this gross misunderstanding of the word abuse. When they say that Amber Heard and Johnny Depp both abused each other, this idea of mutual abuse, which has been kind of debunked by many experts, especially when it comes to Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, because there is such an obvious power imbalance. And when we use the word abuse, you have to think about the power imbalance. And I think in the general public, when people were looking at this case, there was this gigantic misunderstanding where people were saying she abused him because she hit him. And I will say that Amber Heard has never, ever admitted to abusing Johnny Depp, ever. She doesn't think that that's the case. When he asked her, do you think I abused you, she said yes. And when he asked her, do you think you're an abuser, she said no. She doesn't believe that she's an abuser. And he, on the other hand, has said, and I quote, I left last night, honestly, I swear to you, because I couldn't take the idea of more physicality. more physical abuse on each other. So this entire time he seems to be humoring this idea that there was abuse in their relationship. He's definitely admitting to perpetrating some of it. And that's why this idea of mutual abuse is his best case scenario. He continuously said that he had a monster inside of him, and that was the reason why he ran away and locked himself away, was because he was going to recognize when he was starting to go sideways, when he was getting too angry, and that's why he would eliminate himself from the situation to take some time out. And I think it's really important that we don't define abuse as, like, because she said that she hit him, that means she's an abuser. That's not true. Just because she hit someone, that doesn't mean that you're an abuser necessarily, because the best way to evaluate who is the abuser is based on who has the control, and look for signs of coercive control, and that's the best way to examine it. The reason why you see so many experts siding with Amber Heard is because this is such a classic case of one person sort of ticking every single box in what abuse is. Like with Johnny Depp, he seemed to have done everything. He admits to stalking her. People have been reporting on Amber's actions when he's away. He has the surveillance footage, and he seems to be continuously watching her even after they broke up. And those videos were shown to us of people visiting her, and this is an example of coercive control. Seeing her scripts, commenting on the clothes she would wear, these are examples of coercive control. He invited a few of her friends and her sister to move into a building, into his building, and they would and if one of them didn't, if they sort of upset him, if they upset him in any way, he could remove them. Like, he removed a few people one by one, including Io. Her sister ended up moving out, and this is a form of isolation as well. On top of that, because they're both actors, they would live in different areas, so they weren't always in one place. And Amber describes these physical abuse, like one of the major physical assaults have happened in countries where she's completely isolated. She says London, Tokyo, the island, Australia. So these are places where she could be separated from everyone else, and that could be a form of isolation. So he seemed to have ticked so many boxes in the abusive wheel. He commented about how he was the better decision maker, that she should have followed his advice, and he would be upset with Amber Heard for not following his advice in her career decisions. And this is a form of like emotional abuse. There was a lot of signs of emotional abuse in their relationship, and I think it was kind of undeniable because the jury does say that they both abused each other, so those forms of abuse are definitely true. And what I'm gonna do is link a video in the description of a killer whale attacking a trainer in like SeaWorld, and I just want you to scroll down to the comments and see what people say, because when it comes to Amber Heard hitting Johnny Depp, personally, I don't think I could care less that she hit Johnny Depp based on the known facts of what he definitely did do to her. I don't think I really couldn't care less that she did hit him. I don't think that this is a mutual abusive relationship. I think once you've trapped someone in the way he trapped her and closed off her ability to make decisions, her autonomy in that way, when he's made threats to her directly, saying that if she ever left him, that, you know, sort of threatening to kill her. Even on tape, we've heard him saying that, you know, it could be a murder on his hands, the crime scene waiting to happen, and the surveillance that he was doing whenever she was doing a movie. All these things. I think once you've trapped someone in that sense, once someone has reacted physically in response, I don't think we need to act like it's the be-all, end-all, like that's the worst thing to possibly do. I think deep down, most of us do not care about low-level violence in the way he described. I don't think that that's enough to say that it is abuse. The best factor of understanding who the abusive partner is based on coercive control. And interestingly enough, because this juror has said that she should have counted on Johnny Depp, she should have still been dependent on him after the relationship and tried to use his connection to further her own career, it suggests that they have this huge misunderstanding. If the roles were reversed, if the gender roles were reversed, I don't think that this is something that would make sense to say that you should think twice about writing a vague article about your experiences and the Violence Against Women Act so as to not piss off a former partner of yours, because they might feel the need to derail your entire career and your social standing because you sort of crossed them. You should think about everything you say in the future, because it could, even when you word it so vaguely, it could reflect badly on them, and you should think about everything so much. I think that they are playing into what the abuser wants by saying something like that. They think that it's right for him to have that much control over her, and I think that's something that we should re-examine. Like, why do you believe that she should continue to be depending on being in his good graces for the rest of her life, even though he's saying these horrible things to her, like that she's a worthless hooker, that he should fuck her to be sure that she's dead, and all this, like all that stuff. She should still play nice with him. Why does this person believe that? The purpose of coercive control is to destroy the woman's, I think it could be woman or man's autonomy, and make their ability to make decisions and to act on their own behalf. Why is Johnny Depp being backed up by saying that is what should happen to Amber Heard, that she shouldn't have her own agency, she shouldn't be allowed to do what she wants to do or say what she wants to say, because she had this relationship with him? She can't even talk about abuse at all. She's apparently not allowed to speak about the topic of abuse at all, even though it may not even be about him. That's what he is trying to say to you, and people are saying that he's in the right for this. And ultimately, it's not just Johnny Depp's fault. This is everyone who has backed him up, all his minions, everyone who agrees with this sentiment is part of the problem, I think. So now that I've explained some of the background of what one juror said about their decision making, I want to look into this point in Amber's appeal where it says, setting aside a jury verdict is necessary when the award is so excessive that it shocks the conscience, creating the impression that the jury was influenced by passion, corruption, or prejudice. Though this one juror says that they only focus on the evidence, they were very selective about what evidence they did focus on when speaking about this pledge donation thing, and I think it does appear to be corrupt. The numbers that they arrived on appear to be a joke, by saying it was supposed to be $15 million to Johnny Depp. I think that it seems like a personal jab towards Amber Heard to say it's more than double what she received in her divorce settlement. I think that's a very strange number to land on. I don't think that anyone could give you a rational explanation for why they said $15 million for him and $2 million for her, not understanding what punitive damages was at first, and awarding it $5 million. It shows that they really did lack some understanding with that. They also bring up that when the jury has misconceived or misunderstood the facts of the law, again, when we have this quote from a juror saying that they both abuse each other, that suggests that they've misunderstood what they are supposed to be deciding on. So that's a really important factor. And also it says that when the award is so out of proportion to the injury suffered as to suggest that it is not the product of a fair and impartial decision. Again, I think that this makes sense because they also bring up the fact that Heard argued that the $10 million verdict is unsupported by the facts, and it seems to demonstrate that the jurors failed to focus on the fallout from the 2018 op-ed piece, which is what they were supposed to do, and instead just broadly looked at the damage to Johnny Depp's career and reputation suffered as a result of the alleged abuse. And on top of that, there appears to be no reputational damage to Johnny Depp's based on the op-ed, because they were only supposed to look from a very narrow point in time, which was December 18, 2018, which was when the op-ed was released, and up to November 2nd, 2020, which was after the UK judgment. And he didn't lose anything in that time. He had been in many movies since Amber got the TRO, so there's no reason to believe that the abuse allegations affected him that much. And they must have been aware that Johnny Depp had a large support base despite these abuse allegations, and that it didn't really ruin his life. We know that this amount of money is kind of out of proportion to the injury suffered, because he didn't really lose anything based on this op-ed. We don't know for certain if the Pirates of the Caribbean was lost based on the op-ed. And he still has his brand deal with Dior despite everything. And he's been making 2 movies since the verdict was done, and he already had plans to do that, so there's no reason to think that he suffered that much reputational damage based on the op-ed. The only thing that he did lose was this role in Fantastic Beasts, but that was after the UK trial, so that was probably the reason why, and he was still paid his full pay for that movie, so he didn't lose that much money as a result, and you're not supposed to weigh that into account when you award damages to him based on the op-ed. I think these are really great points, and I don't see how the numbers that the jury sort of gave out based on, after a few minutes of deliberation, they came out with these numbers, so I don't see any way that it will stand as is. I would predict that they would probably throw out the whole case, because it suggests that the jury just didn't know what they were doing. It also brings up the fact that the trial court's denial of a motion to set aside the verdict as excessive is subject to review for abuse of discretion. And I think that this is kind of interesting, to bring up the fact that the judge did not spell out the rationale for rejecting Heard's motion to grant the mistrial because on the ground that it is an inherently and irreconcilable inconsistent with the verdict against Depp. That's a very good reason to kind of say that there's something off about the jury decision, and the judge could have said that when they argued the mistrial, but she never explained why she okayed that. It just stood as it was. The only thing that she explained was this idea of the wrong juror, but that was it. So that's an interesting thing that they're gonna investigate. So I think that's pretty good. I don't think that there's any way that people who look through this appeal can see the jury's verdict and think that it was something that made sense. Just as it is. So I think both of their appeals will be granted. I think the judge made a mistake by not saying that a few months back. The point that they made about actual malice is very interesting because in the trial, Johnny Depp said about 6 years ago, Heard made some quite heinous and disturbing, brought these certain criminal acts against me that were not based in any species of truth. And he's kind of trying to, it makes it seem like he's suing her for getting the TRO in 2016. Now, when Amber Heard got this TRO and laid out these 3 incidents, Johnny Depp said that neither party made false accusations for financial gain. And when we went through this trial, they presented some evidence of Johnny Depp sort of kind of agreeing with Amber Heard about the violence, about the abuse in their relationship, calling himself a monster, saying that he needed to be locked away, things of that nature. And now he's turning around and saying that these abuse claims were not based in any species of truth. So he would argue that during the relationship he was kind of placating Amber Heard. So she would tell him, even back in 2013, she would tell him that when he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol, he would turn into a monster and he would hit her and be violent with her. And he did not argue with her. He apologized to her and ended up marrying her in 2015 despite her continuously making these accusations against him. Now, if his point is that Amber Heard is delusional or crazy, that would still mean that Amber Heard believes that she was abused by him, because he continuously humored her and by placating her, he's agreeing with her, he's going along with these supposed delusions. Therefore, there's no reason to believe that Amber Heard doesn't believe that she was a victim of abuse if that person is continuously saying, you're right, maybe you are right, I did abuse you in this situation. And there are quotes of Johnny Depp saying that he couldn't take more physical abuse on each other, even when they go to therapy sessions and she's listing out some of these violent acts and he's not disagreeing with her. Yes, he's still placating. There's not enough to say that this whole thing is a hoax. There's not enough to say that Amber Heard doesn't believe it. And the point is that Johnny Depp doesn't just win by saying that by proving that the abuse did not occur. He's supposed to prove that Amber Heard doesn't believe that these things occurred. And throughout this, we have been shown so much evidence that Amber Heard, at the very least, seems to believe that these things did happen. Now, if they want to turn around and say it's because she's crazy and da-da-da, so be it. It's not, you don't have proof of actual malice, therefore he should have lost his claim entirely based on that. So, as we all know, in the UK court case, Johnny Depp's failed in his endeavour to call this wifebeater label defamatory because they had ruled that he had abused his ex-wife Amber Heard on at least 12 occasions, with some incidents leaving her to fear for her life. And this makes sense because we've also had this tape from Johnny Depp saying that he was frightened of their situation, crime scene waiting to happen, he's worried about there being a murder on his hands if Amber Heard stuck around. So there's all that stuff, so you can understand why he lost his court case. And what I found was really interesting in this appeal was they brought up that in a cross-examination, Amber's team was not allowed to ask Johnny Depp this one question, and because the judge sustained an objection, which kind of didn't make a lot of sense, which was he was asked whether the statement, "I became a public figure representing abuse," was accurate, and the objection was sustained on the ground of it calling for a legal conclusion, which is kind of absurd, I think, because, you know, if you think about this thing of her getting a TRO, There are these pictures that are out of her injured face, and it's kind of been in the public sphere, the global circulation of him abusing his wife. She alleged that he beat her on at least 3 occasions, was granted this temporary restraining order from a US judge who looked at her evidence and said, yeah, it makes sense that you want a restraining order from this person based on what you've shown us. And this is the US, I'm talking about a US judge thinking that Amber Heard provided good enough evidence to provide a restraining order. That is 4 judges, 3 in the UK, 1 in the US, who did believe Amber Heard's evidence that Johnny Depp did abuse Amber Heard. And yet somehow they had to waste 6 weeks deliberating on this thing that should have been a very easy case. It didn't need all this discussion back and forth about what happened. We didn't need all that. It's very clear that Johnny Depp did abuse Amber Heard, so there didn't need to be this long drawn out thing. And he stated that neither party made false accusations for financial gain. So yeah, it's weird that we had to do all this. I do not see the actual malice on Amber Heard's side based on the evidence shown to us. And speaking of this kind of like reputational damage to Johnny Depp and the money that he lost, like he was seeking $50 million because his pay for Pirates of the Caribbean is $40 million, and that's what he was trying to get for this short period of time. It was around like 2 years, from December 2018 to November 2020. That's the short period of time where they had to provide damages. They awarded him $10 million, even though basically nothing was lost in that short period of time. And him saying, oh, I lost the role in Pirates of the Caribbean 6. Pirates of the Caribbean 6 is not a movie that exists. They have not made it, so you can't really award damages for a movie that doesn't exist. And they also said that they quoted Johnny Depp when he testified that he would not have agreed to play a role in Pirates 6 even for $300 million and 1 million alpacas. And this isn't because he's mad at them now. Even before any of this drama, when he was filming Pirates 5, he said that he was done making Pirates movie. He was sick of whoring himself out. He didn't want to do it anymore. He's expressed that before. And the jury did see those text messages in the US trial. So, and it makes sense that they didn't award him his $50 million that he asked for. They awarded him a smaller amount. It was $10 million. So it's very strange how they arrived at that number. I don't think that there's any logic behind it. I think they just kind of pulled it out of thin air. There's no rationality behind it. There was no evidence presented by Depp that he lost any other opportunities because of the op-ed. I think it's pretty obvious that men accused of abuse don't really lose that much as a result of it, based in terms of reputation and in terms of the money. Like, lots of people can have careers even if this wife-beater aspect is true. I don't think that necessarily matters to a lot of people. Can we name anyone who lost their job specifically based on domestic abuse? I mean, not sexual assault, I mean domestic abuse. Has anyone really lost opportunities based on that? Because I don't think that is the factor for why he lost things. Ultimately, it just seems like I'm witnessing this disgusting displacement of the blame of his kind of drug addiction and his lateness on set being the true reason why Disney dropped him, and trying to say that it's the fault of this woman and her writing this little article that nobody read, nobody cared about what she had to say, and saying that that's the reason for his sort of downfall, when that's not actually the case. When Amber Heard testified, she unequivocally said that she believed that Johnny Depp had abused her physically, verbally, emotionally, and psychologically. And Depp and his expert witness conceded that abuse can take many forms, including verbal, emotional, and psychological. Camille Vasquez, even in her closing statements, admits that Johnny Depp did, in fact, verbally abuse Amber Heard, and you hear the jury saying that they yelled at each other and that they both abused each other. So I think that there is enough evidence to agree that verbal, emotional, psychological abuse occurred in this relationship. So there's no reason to say that there is proof of actual malice when there is that much evidence of those things. Some examples of this that was presented in court was a tape of Depp demanding that Heard cut him with a knife and threatening to cut himself in her presence when she refused to comply, this being an example of emotional abuse. They said that Depp engaged in violent behavior in Heard's vicinity in multiple occasions, including kicking cabinets and doors, smashing glasses, punching a light fixture, toppling racks of clothing in her closet, throwing one rack down a staircase. This all property destruction. This is an example of like psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and so that's something that was shown to the jury. They also explained this idea of coercive control and how Johnny Depp definitely did exhibit jealous and controlling behavior towards Amber Heard, such as accusing her of infidelity and promiscuity, including in messages written around the house with his own blood. That's definitely an act of abuse. He also forbid her from acting in movies or having meetings. That was something that was shown, text messages telling her no goddamn meetings, and things like that, encouraging her to take his advice of what she should do in her career. So this example of coercive control it was laid out. And then we also need to take into account that he did admit to headbutting Amber Heard, and though he claims it was unintentional, there's no reason to necessarily believe his version of events once you have this proof of the other types of abuse. It's not necessarily likely that was an unintentional headbutt. And another thing that I want to talk about is how in the US, a US judge said that Amber Heard granted Amber Heard this temporary restraining order based on the 3 incidents she laid out and the evidence that she presenting this cabinet photo, because that was something that Johnny Depp and his team kind of scoffed at. A lot of people said that this doesn't count as abuse, and bring up this factor of this case being held in Virginia and not the state of California, because that is something that is a really good point for her appeal, is that it's the wrong place to do it, because in the state of California, when she filed for this restraining order, it was granted when she provided some of this evidence of him smashing things. They said that in this state, that kind of thing does count as abusive behavior. So if in Virginia people kind of feel differently about it, their opinion maybe is less relevant because a US judge already ruled in her favor when he granted her a TRO, and that is not always easy to do. You can't always get a restraining order against someone, and they said that she did have enough evidence to grant her one. And then it ends by saying that the record contains many other examples of disputed evidence of abuse. The court not even need to consider those to appropriately conclude that the trial court should have struck the jury verdict for Depp's failure to prove actual malice. So once again, I wanted to look back at this quote from the juror in the Good Morning America interview, where he said that Heard's defense ultimately did not prove that Depp was physically abusive towards the actress. On the contrary, the jury found that Heard was actually the aggressor in their relationship. And that is an interesting quote to me, because there was a tape that was played to the jurors which said, where Amber Heard says, "I didn't punch you, I was hitting you, I did not punch you, I did not fucking deck you." And then Johnny Depp replied saying, "You couldn't deck me." He's kind of, so that's an interesting thing for him to say, that it's kind of a laughable thing for her to hit him like that. It makes it seem like Amber Heard is not hitting/punching him very often if he is going to reply saying to her, "You couldn't deck me." It suggests that he is not in any way physically intimidated by her. He also on that tape taunts her by saying, how are your toes, in reference to the fact that he's crushed her toes between the door. So he was saying to her, how are your toes? So it suggests that he didn't feel like she was like someone who could really hurt him if he was willing to do that. So it's very strange that the jury landed on this idea that she was actually the aggressor in their relationship, even though Johnny Depp has this quote of saying that he couldn't take the idea of more physical abuse on each other. Does it sound like Amber Heard could have inflicted that much physical abuse on him if he has said to her, "You couldn't deck me"? I don't really think so. And they ended with the point that even if the jury could properly have concluded that these undisputed facts did not constitute abuse, and a reasonable jury could not have done so, Depp presented no evidence that undercut her testimony that she believed this conduct amounted to abuse. So that is a really good point to make. Just because in their situation they may think that destruction of property isn't really abusive, they may think that blood writing isn't abusive, but that doesn't mean that Amber Heard doesn't believe that those things are abusive. So that is something that you need to take into account. And they say that consequently Depp failed to meet his burden on the second prong of actual malice. I think that it's very reasonable to believe that Amber Heard does believe that writing those deranged messages in his own blood was kind of abusive. Calling her these names all the time was abusive. It's very, I don't know, I think it is right to say that this was not a reasonable jury to come out with that conclusion. So, in conclusion, Amber Heard requests that the court reverse the judgment against her and either enter judgment for her or dismiss Depp's claims without prejudice or remand for a new trial. And they bring up this point about how Johnny Depp was improperly allowed to suggest that the jury could award damages based on statements Heard made prior to the publication of the op-ed, and the jury was not informed of the outcome of the UK proceeding. And Johnny Depp was ruled to be a wife-beater in 2020, and that was the thing that caused some reputational harm. And the jury was instructed to specifically keep the damages between the short period of time between December 2018 till November 2020. And it's very clear based on the size of the compensatory damages awarded to him that they did not follow those instructions. There's no basis as to why Johnny Depp would receive $10 million for that short period of time, because he didn't lose anything. He didn't lose any money in that time space. So it doesn't make sense that they would say that. So it very clearly states, at a minimum, the jury's excessive damages verdict should be reversed and the case should be remanded for a new trial on damages. So I think that definitely as a minimum they are going to throw out what the jury said, there isn't a good justification, a logical explanation for why they would have come up with that number. We'll see what happens. I would predict that they'll just toss it out because neither of the judgments make sense, and this idea of like it being an irreconcilable verdict is definitely the strongest point. There's no way that the verdicts will stand the way that they are, because there can only be one winner and one loser in this, and they need to pick one. It could take a long time to figure out what will happen next, so we'll just wait and see.